Welcome to another RPG Bugbears video. This video was inspired by a post from Trayvon Reams on the YouTube RPG Brigade Facebook group and is about orphan backgrounds. Now, I'm sure that most roleplayers will have had an encounter with the orphan background, but if you haven't, then let me explain. The orphan background is where a player seeks to create a character background that has little or no ties to the campaign world. You know the sort. Their parents were killed when they were young, and since then they've been making their own way in the world, with only their trusty katana and double-barreled shotgun for company. That's right, it's the return of Trenchcoat McNinja Sword, the normally fairly generic combat monster with little background and no emotional or social ties to the campaign world that can be possibly used to draw him or her into any plot. A character type that is normally so boring that it can be basically summed up with the sound. Now, backgrounds are one of the first chances a player has to be creative in a game. They're also a chance to give the GM an idea about what sort of game you're looking to play, and also to work some NPCs into the background. For example, as a GM, if your background tells me that you were once part of a church in your campaign world that turned out to be an evil cult bent on unleashing a deadly beast from beyond the stars on the world, but that you escaped with the help of your older sister, then straight away I've got an organisation, a threat, and at least one NPC that I can add into my campaign world that I know will interest you as a player. If you get this sort of background from each PC, then the game world starts to take shape before your very eyes. However, if your background tells me that you have no parents, no friends, and that you roam around the country with only the equipment you have on you and the soft throb of your motorcycle for company, looking for evildoers to shoot with your trusty shotgun, then all that tells me is that you like motorcycles and shooting people. Hardly the most inspiring start for a campaign. So, if the orphan/loner background is so poor, why do people do it, you might ask? Now, I've come across numerous variations of this type of character, and overwhelmingly the answer has been that the player is worried that if they create a background with NPCs and people or places that the character cares about, the GM will systematically destroy them or use them to get at the PC. Now, there is a grain of truth in this, since elements of a background can be used as plot hooks. However, a good GM should not, in my opinion, make a player feel victimised. Constantly killing off background NPCs or destroying background resources with merry abandon will just lead players to not investing that much effort into them. In the same way that if your game is a meat grinder where PCs are dying left, right and centre, you can't be surprised when players don't put as much effort into creating a character, if they know it's only going to be alive for a few encounters. So, there are a few things that can be done about this. Try to encourage players to create backgrounds. If a person doesn't feel comfortable with writing a long story, or if you prefer not to have to read through long stories, then just ask them to provide a simple bullet point list. Perhaps if people are struggling, you can provide some additional guidelines. For instance, you may insist that the players detail where they were born, who their parents were, what their first job was, or detail a close friend of theirs, just to give a few examples. When you actually get into playing a game, try not to just simply kill or destroy background resources, but rather use them to throw plot to the players. Background resources can, of course, be threatened by your campaign villains, but if it does become necessary to destroy them, try and do so in a way that is dramatic and really involves that player in the plot, giving them a chance to get revenge or gain some insight about your campaign's villain, or maybe even garner a resource of similar value in exchange. People I've spoken to who play this sort of one-dimensional character tend to do so for one of two reasons. One, they're not that interested in the game or can't be bothered to put effort into creating a background for their character. Or two, they've had an unfortunate experience with a GM who constantly used backgrounds as a way to target a character's weaknesses, so they decided to eliminate the background to stop it being used against them. If it's reason one that you're coming up against, then you have to question whether or not the person is going to fit in with your game. If you're running a hack and slash dungeon crawl where character backgrounds may not be that important, if you want a more character driven game, then someone who isn't that invested may not be the best match. By all means, try to encourage them and coax them into creating a more suitable character, a more detailed and nuanced character, using some of the guidelines we've given above and many other of the suitable videos that are available on YouTube. But be prepared for potential disappointment. And if they aren't a suitable match for your game, then you may have to go your separate ways. Not every person suits every type of game. If you're faced with reason 2, then you really need to assure your players that backgrounds are going to be used to create interesting plot, rather than just as a way to out and out harm characters. Ask yourself, for instance, if a player is pursued by an assassin cult as part of their background, is it more interesting for the cult just to shoot the player character with a poisoned blowpipe and for them to die in agony out of the blue? Or is it more interesting for them to attempt to capture the player character as part of some larger nefarious scheme, which the PCs can then investigate? I'm sure you won't have to think hard to arrive at an answer. In conclusion, if you're a GM, encourage your players to create backgrounds. Lead by example. Make your NPCs have interesting backgrounds. Ask the players questions to prompt them to discuss their backgrounds. And when they do, use backgrounds to make the game more interesting, and not just as a list of things that can be bumped off to inconvenience the player characters. And if you're a player character, then I beg you, please, please, let's see an end to Orphan style characters. I really cannot overstress how much a good background lifts a character out of the domain of just being a handful of stats on a piece of paper into being a rounded, nuanced and textured character. And as I said earlier on, it's also an opportunity for you as a player to tell the GM, this is what interests me, this is the sort of game I want to play, this is the sort of thing I'd like to see in a game. So I think it'd be foolish not to make best use of it. And if you've got a good GM, then they won't just simply use it as a way of victimising your character. They'll use it as a way to bring you into the plot, to get you involved. And I found when I've been a player that there's nothing cooler than seeing a bit of plot pop up that relates to something you've created as part of the background. So, I hope you've enjoyed this video. You'll consider clicking on like and clicking on the red dice to subscribe to my channel. Until I see you next time, this has been RPG Bugbears for Red Dice Diaries. Take care and happy gaming.